We're talking about what does it mean to be a manager in the 21st century and what are the tools that you need to be effective. Conflict is inevitable and workplace microaggressions are likely to occur as one of these types of conflicts. It's sort of the reality of having a globally dispersed and more diverse workplace. So when CHROs think about workplace microaggressions, they should understand that this really matters, right? For the performance of their organization in terms of its productivity and the team's performance outcomes, but it also matters for each of the individuals who are entrusted to their sort of care and development. Most people want to be good people, right, and believe that they are, so they don't realize that what they actually believe is an assumption is potentially a bias. So that's what makes them very difficult to sort of address. I'm Summer Jackson. I'm a professor in the Organizational Behavior Unit here at Harvard Business School, and I study organizational inequality. So I look at social categories such as race, class, and gender, and their implications in workplaces for people's hiring, promotion, and retention. So workplace microaggressions as a concept has been around since the 1970s. Chester Pierce was one of the first people to coin the term. And then Daryl Tsu in the 1990s did a lot of work to sort of bring it into the more general consciousness. But microaggressions at work are basically any interaction, verbal, paraverbal, or sort of like body language even related, that can subtly subordinate a person's identity. So can make a person feel less than because of one of their social identities. And that could be their race, their gender, their class, their sexual orientation, or their able-bodiedness. And they can often happen unintentionally, right? A person who's doing it doesn't even know that they have done that to another person, which is what makes them so pernicious. Conflict is inevitable, and workplace microaggressions are likely to occur as one of these types of conflicts. It's sort of the reality of having a globally dispersed and more diverse workplace, right, is that we bring these sort of taken for granted assumptions into the workplace. Our theory helps people understand how to come back from these scenarios, but why we're really excited about it is it helps organizations understand how to build resilience when they do happen so they can come back even stronger. If you think about what microaggressions look like, right, where someone says like, oh, I didn't realize you were so articulate there, right? And you're perhaps a Black woman in a workplace in a position of power. This question of being articulate or not sort of calls into question your competence, or you're behaving differently than a way that I would have thought, right? Because it should just be table stakes. And of course, given my position, I am an articulate, competent person in the workplace. The most likely sort of reaction there is this avoidance or withdrawal, right? You have this confusion between what's happened, both the person who committed the microaggression and the person who's receiving it are sort of in their own heads about trying to understand what happens. And so the most likely outcome is that the relationship sort of deteriorates or the person sort of withdraws from it. But our theory shows that there are actually ways in which you can come back from it and not only just repair the relationship to where it was before, but in some ways make it even stronger. And to help us understand how to do that, we looked at sort of how these microaggressions as a relational fracture sort of create these self-image threats for both the person who said the microaggression and the person who receives the microaggression. And so what's key there is sort of drawing on important elements of the relationship to make it better. So we call those things like relational closeness, a shared interaction history of positive DEI interactions, and also sort of that we have a sense of long-term viability, right? We focus on work for this exact reason because it's not always possible to just sever a relationship at work, right? You still have to work together to complete a project. And so this sort of like long-term viability is a potential precondition that we can draw on to try and make the relationships better. When you're on the receiving end of a workplace microaggression, a sort of clash of reality happens and you can feel demeaned or belittled or undervalued. It can bring up the sense of betrayal, trying to understand why the person committed it. All of these sort of emotions sort of are more likely to result in withdrawal, right, or avoidance. But if you can actually transform your motivation and start to sort of, instead of approaching it from a place of fear, try and approach it from a place of learning and inquiry, you can transform your motivation so that you really try to understand what did happen in this incident and how can we move forward from it. So instead of still feeling the sort of afraid and fear, now you take on an inquiry position and you want to understand what happened. And from that position, that's how you're better able to sort of repair the relationship. But equally important is for the person who has committed the microaggression to also transform their motivation, right? For both sets of parties, it's important to sort of transform the motivation and sort of approach it from a learning and inquiry, asking questions, being open to hearing what another person is saying, instead of reading in an intent or quickly coming to judgment. Imagine, right, that this is actually very hard to do, right? Which is another reason why relational deterioration, right, this withdrawal or removal from the situation is the most likely outcome. But that's why we sort of call upon both parties to focus on pre-existing conditions in their relationship, right? Because we have a shared work history, because we have a sense that our work matters together, right? That we have this relational history with each other, it can sort of help us find the reason and the rationale to look beyond this individual incident and try and figure out within a pattern of our interactions, where does this fit and where does this fit with my sense of who you are and your sense of who I am. So unconscious biases are difficult, right? Because they are our own taken for granted assumptions about people, places, cultures. And often you don't even realize they're a bias until you actually articulate them and someone else confronts you with the idea that that was offensive or hurtful or demeaning, right? Otherwise, you probably would not have said it, right? Most people want to be good people, right? And believe that they are. So they don't realize that what they actually believe is an assumption is potentially a bias. So that's what makes them very difficult to sort of address. But we all carry these biases, right? They're all informed by how we were raised, where we were raised, who we interacted with, what we're exposed to, right? And so it's almost through this iterative process of being exposed to new information and new people and new ways of thinking, incorporating that into our morals and values, that we're able to sort of address these unconscious biases, both by learning that they are a bias and not an assumption, and then sort of understanding how to be different in the next scenario. As we become like a more global and diverse like workplace, we're going to have more and more people from all these different places interacting. And so it's only more likely that we are going to be confronted with our own unconscious biases that we didn't realize in the last year's workforce was a bias, because we never had a person who had that type of family structure or had come from that country or, was raised in that way. And so now you have to learn that what you thought made sense is actually an unconscious bias, and you have to work together. So when CHROs think about workplace microaggressions, they should understand that this really matters, right, for the performance of their organization in terms of its productivity and the team's performance outcomes. But it also matters for each of the individuals who are entrusted to their sort of care and development, right? It matters for those employees' morale, for their sense of well-being, for their sense of belonging. And if you can't address that, then you're going to be constantly facing turnover and attrition. And especially amongst people who you may have spent a lot of time and effort trying to recruit, now they're going to go lend their talents and skills to somebody else. We've been talking about how workplaces are becoming increasingly more global and diverse, right? Which means that the likelihood of microaggressions occurring is probably becoming even higher, right? Because we all have these taken for granted assumptions or these unspoken biases or implicit biases about people. But what you can do to try and address and sort of build resilience into your organization when a microaggression happens is two things. The first is you can make sure that every one of your employees has a sort of shared sense of work meaningfulness, which means that they really understand why their day-to-day work matters. Because when a microaggression happens, understanding that getting beyond it and being able to continue to work with this person because the work that happens with them really matters for the organization, for society, or for your community, is one thing that can help transform those people's motivation to try and work together better. The other thing that you can do is really underscore a sense of shared DEI norms and values. So that's making sure that everyone understands that when they come to work every day, we have a shared sense of what does it mean to be a good colleague to someone, what does it mean to be professional and collegial, and really drawing upon those norms so that people understand that for the most part, everyone is trying to act from a place of being a good person. And so when a microaggression happens, you can better understand it as an individual incident instead of a pattern of behavior. Or if it is a pattern of behavior, that as an organization, you can very clearly point out that it is not something that your organization tolerates. When we think about embodying sort of our shared workplace norms, right, that we approach every day in trying to make sure that we are interacting with our colleagues from a place of mutual respect, professionalism, and those sorts of values, then when you ask the question about trying to understand this family celebration that's new to you, for example, the person understands that you're not doing that because you think it's weird, right? Or why would you ever do that? But you're doing it because you're curious. You're genuinely curious. And I think in terms of how do you present as your authentic self, like if you have an authentic self that is genuinely curious about the world, people will respond to that in a way that allows you to continue to sort of broaden your exposure to new people and new ways of thinking and new cultures without committing offense, because that is sort of like, that sort of curiosity can become infectious. Regardless of what's happening with DEI in workplaces right now, our theory still has a place because we're talking about what does it mean to be a manager in the 21st century and what are the tools that you need to be effective? How do you need to understand your employees? How do you build a sense of shared purpose amongst your employees, a sense of shared norms of what it means to be professional and collegial in the workplace, to care for one another? And how do you make sure that you can keep your global and globally distributed diverse teams performing and effective with high morale and high retention numbers?